Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Inspiration for Today. Glad you tuned in. This is day 4 of our study through the book of Ecclesiastes, which I just love. It's one of my favorite books, especially in the Old Testament, where King Solomon, who, of course, as you know, wrote the book of Proverbs, and he had amazing wisdom. And here he is toward the end of his life, and he's thinking about life and what in his life counted. And as you've seen so far, that from man's perspective, he says it's meaningless. It's meaningless. It's all meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. Well, then he says why it is, though, from God's perspective, how and why it is meaningful. I thought it'd be important today for us. We're in the middle of our study. Let's go back and review. And actually, we didn't talk in total length about just who King Solomon was and why he's so wise. And if you grab your Bible, and it goes back to Solomon's story is actually recorded in the book of First Kings. First Kings. See if you can find that. It's, after the first 5, it's before Psalms, before Job. And the book of First Kings tells us so much about Solomon. And especially I wanted us to read today in First Kings chapter 3, why Solomon is so wise. Well, it goes back, and this is an amazing thing that doesn't happen to very many people, if any others. But in 1 Kings 3, God was so pleased with Solomon, and he was walking so closely with the Lord, and he had just offered, you see in verse 4, he'd offered 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord. 1,000, wow. But then verse 5, let me read it. It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask whatever you want me to give to you. Can you imagine? The God of the universe asked, what do you want? What would you say? What would you say? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's just amazing, because whatever you do ask, God has the power to actually give it. Not many people. This is not like a genie or something. This is God. Well, Solomon gives a lot of prelim to what his answer is, but he finally gives his answer to God in verse 9. And here's what he says. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, to distinguish between right and wrong. Solomon's asking for wisdom. He's asking for wisdom. How to govern your people, Lord. That's amazing. And God was so pleased with that answer. And what God says next is I want us to know, because when we now read the book of Ecclesiastes, or Proverbs for that matter, you can understand why they're so great. Verse 10, the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor asked for the death of your enemies or anything else, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. In other words, God makes Solomon the wisest person who ever lived. There'll never be another one like you, God says. So should there be any surprise then that what Solomon writes is totally wise? Wise in the things of God, that is, at least. Moreover, then verse 13, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor. So God gave Solomon it all. He gave it all. He gave him that wisdom and that discerning heart. But he also gave him the riches, and Solomon became the wealthiest person who had ever lived up to that time, and maybe forever. I don't really know how the dollars would equate today, but he had it all. He had it all. And that's why, and that's good for us to know that, because then when we come back to the book of Ecclesiastes, and Solomon is frustrated at life because he is now in his older age, he realizes that the normal acts of life are going to be forgotten anyway. He calls it a chasing after the wind. And that's what we've been reading in this book about the various parts of life and Solomon's take on them and what's actually important in life. And isn't that a tremendous lesson for you and I? I believe it is. Well, we've gone through the first 3 chapters. We come back to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and obviously we're not going to be able to read every verse and even delve into every aspect of life that Solomon saw as useless or meaningless. But chapter 4, he looks at such things that, like oppression, everything taking place under the sun. Just some people are oppressed. Well, that's sure not worthwhile. Verse 4, chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes, verse 4, he says, "And I saw that all labor and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is what? Meaningless, a chasing after the wind." And he goes and he lists several other things, and then just drop down to pick out another one there in verse 13. He says, "Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to take warning." And he goes through verse 16. "But those who came later were not pleased with the successor of the king. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." And I think about, what in life then does last? And there are a couple points in Ecclesiastes where he makes it clear what is important. And chapter 5 is one of those. And he says, "But in light of all of that, take seriously," verse 1, "guard your steps when you go to the house of God." When you go to the house of God, that is important. And then he talks about that. And end of verse 2, "God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few." And then if that wasn't making it clear enough that things of God are important, and you know why they're important? Because God lasts forever. And he knows you, and he knows how you're living your life. And Solomon realizes God is what brings meaning to life. It's the only thing that lasts. Verse 4, he even says, "When you make a vow to God, don't delay in fulfilling it." That is important. But if you promise something of God, you do that. You do that. Why? Because God is not meaningless. What he is involved with, that brings meaning. Verse 7, for this part, Solomon makes it clear. "Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, stand in awe of God." Stand in awe of God. The things of God are not meaningless. They're full of meaning. And we're going to see exactly why tomorrow. Solomon has another verse, and we read it early in the week, but we're going to go in more depth to it, that brings total meaning and purpose to life. And it's the things that will be remembered, and there aren't many. Solomon goes through everything, and if we sit today and think about so much in life, we live life, and we're supposed to do these things, but they'll be forgotten. Our kids, grandkids, whatever, will never remember them. Well, friends, we have one more day in Ecclesiastes. I'm totally enjoying this. I hope you are also. Hey, we'll see you tomorrow. And if there's one section, one verse in this book that you need to remember, it's the one we're going to study in depth tomorrow. See you then. God bless. Have a great day.